You are listening to Medicine and the Machine with Medscape Editor-in-Chief Eric Topol and Master Storyteller and Clinician Abraham Verghese as they talk with experts around the globe about the hottest topics in healthcare. This podcast is intended for U.S. healthcare professionals only.
Hello, this is Eric Topol from Medscape Medicine and the Machine podcast, and we have a very unique combined podcast with my friend Bob Harrington of the Bob Harrington Show, because we are going to interview Abraham Verghese about his new book, The Covenant of Water, also, I would say, the masterpiece. We are really thrilled to have you, Abraham.
It's a strange position to be in, Eric. I'm usually your co-host, and I find myself the subject, but what a delight. Thank you so much.
No, well, Bob and I are going to gang up on you about this. I'm going to let Bob go ahead with why don't you get things started? I got a whole long list of questions.
Yeah, I have my whole long list of questions too that I've been working on while I've read the book over the last few weeks. And as I said before we came on air, Abraham, thank goodness I had a couple of cross-country trips in which I was able to really read through the book and really appreciate the beauty of the book. And I want to thank you and Eric for having me on your podcast, because this will hopefully raise the ratings of my podcast. So that's good. But thank you both. Abraham, it's almost like I don't know where to begin, but can I begin near the end?
Please, except we want to be careful not to give away.
I'm not going to do a reveal, but I want to talk about the medical problem that goes on through generations. And was this something that you had seen as a student or something you had read about? I mean, I was fascinated by how it all plays out.
Yeah, I think, Bob, very much like you and Eric, I have a few zebras that I tuck into my back pocket, and every now and then when I run out of things to talk about on rounds, I'll ask a question like this, what causes... why do we say beware of a man with a giant liver and jaundice and a glass eye? They're little riddles or puzzles. And one of the puzzles that I have always had was this about familial drowning. And the resident's immediate reaction is to talk about cardiac causes and channel disorders. But one of the disorders is the one that I have in the novel, which is not a cardiac disorder. And I guess I've been fascinated by the fact that, over the many, many decades, there are conditions that get labeled, and that's about it. And then decades pass before we truly understand what they were. And I think a great example that I never forgot was, people have known about jaundice for years and years. And they recognized that when you had jaundice, your urine turned very deep yellow. But they also recognized that there was a kind of jaundice that ran in families where the urine did not turn yellow. And they called this acholuric jaundice, jaundice without bile in the urine. And many, many decades later, we now know they were talking about hereditary spherocytosis.
Right.
And so I've always loved that sense of, we're probably dealing with things now that in 90 years will have very clear labels and make us look like primitives. So I wanted to make something like that play out in this novel, which is why it had to be several generations.
Yeah, I'll say, I think traced throughout 7 generations, somewhere along the way between the 3 that appear actually through the book. I guess the thing that struck me the most, and I'm sure interested to get your perspective, is the impact of your mother in this book. Not only about when she responded to your niece with the long manuscript and the sketches she put together, but the names you used in the book, Big Amachi and her granddaughter Miriama. It seems like your mother's influence here, not only of course the geography where she grew up, was profound. Can you talk to that?
Yeah, I think my mother's influence was really, really profound. I think, as you mentioned, when she was in her 70s, she penned this manuscript for my niece, who was 5 years old at the time, because my niece asked her, what was it like when you were a little girl? And my mom just was floored by that question. How does she communicate to a 5-year-old girl what her 5-year-old existence was like. I mean, she was born in the 20s and no running water or lights, which was true when I went to visit in the summers. And, it wasn't a deprivation, far from it. It was a beautiful, ghostly lit evenings that were quite special. And the harsh electric light kind of destroyed that mood. And my mom, she graduated with a degree in physics just about the time India was getting independence, and there were no jobs to be had. So she saw this ad for a teaching position in Africa. And can you imagine a single woman in a sari in the 1940s taking a steamer to Aden and then to Ethiopia, sight unseen? So she clearly had a tremendously daring spirit. And then in her 50s, she came to America and taught junior high. She came here long before I came. And so that by her 70s, she'd lived through so much. And so she began to write this document, handwritten, illustrated, for my niece. So I think that document was a great inspiration for me to set the novel in Kerala. Geography is perhaps the biggest decision you make as a novelist is, where are you going to set this? If I tried to set the same story in Pasadena, it would alter the story completely. So that was huge. But more than my mother, to be honest, it was my grandmother and my great-grandmother by reputation who I really was celebrating, because I think in many novels, mothers are portrayed as evil or flawed, and my grandmother especially, she came to that house when she was a young bride, married to a groom who was just as young as she was. These are, it always startles the Western reader to read in the opening page about a 12-year-old bride getting married. But for the most part, they were marrying 12-year-old boys or 10-year-old boys, and they just became children in that household. In fact, on the tour, I ran into a relative who was showing me some photo albums and pointed to one of my relatives, long deceased, and said, when she was a little girl, and by the way, their bond with their mother-in-law becomes greater than their mother, because they come to this new house at the age of 10. And so this little girl said to her mother-in-law, Amachi, that boy, that annoying fellow, that one over there, can we get rid of him? And that was her husband, So, but anyway, my grandmother lived her life in that compound. I don't think she ever left the place, had no real knowledge of the outside world except from what she read in the paper, and she could read. But she lived a heroic, beautiful life in the confines of that compound, and the influence she had on her family and the love she gave her children. So I think I was really trying to celebrate that kind of quiet heroism, the sort of steady yeoman kind of every day showing up, the faith in small things that I don't think gets featured enough. And it's been very curious. The book has had a wonderful reception, and people are recognizing that quality, that sense of, you can be unknown to the world, and yet you can be heroic and special. And I think that's why it's responding beyond any dreams I had for the book, to be honest.
Abraham, let me extend the question that Eric asked you about your mother and the influence, and your answer in some ways about paying homage to strong women in your life. How does a male author tap into these very feminine qualities, which you explore so beautifully? I mean, I felt like I was listening to my own mother and grandmother, and then I was remembering that, well, this is a male author writing about this. How'd you do that? What was the process?
Well, I actually had a great deal of help from my mother. She lived long enough to be of great help to me as I was writing this. She would tell me different anecdotes, and some of what she wrote out was, very much from a woman's point of view, things I would not have thought about. And then I interviewed many of my cousins and aunts in great detail, and I was so humbled by it. I mean, I had no idea, for example, how much women were harassed when they went to the big city. How much of that kind of everyday teasing went on that really made life a nuisance for them. And the nuances of childbirth, I would really have had no idea about that, except from debriefing my cousins in great detail about that whole experience and the sense of being completely isolated in this other world. And, no one could help you. It was just you and this child trying to come out. And So I think I had a lot of help then. And, where I didn't have help, I had my imagination. So that's where it came from pretty much.
Well, speaking of that imagination, the striking thing was how you went back to 1900 all the way through 1970s. And so not only a geography that perhaps you were only familiar with from summers with your grandparents or medical school at Madras on the other side of the country, I guess, but you were able to historically, I don't think you were making things up. I think you were really attending to details and accuracy. How did you do this? All these decades that, how you could possibly be accurate and take us back in time like that?
Well, I mean, first of all, it was actually a lot of fun, because if you think about it, that's an incredibly important epoch in human history, 2 world wars. And then within India, you had this major upheaval after centuries of colonization. Finally, in the 1940s, you have the country becoming independent. It's a very, very interesting and well-known time period to write about. I actually had a couple of spreadsheets going with all the medical advances year by year from 1900 to 77, and then the political changes in India year by year, the global changes, and always being careful to make sure that the local events I was describing, if someone was listening to a radio, that they were listening to something that could have been actually happening at that moment. But there's a point where research just becomes an excuse not to write. So I did a lot of research, and I actually went back to India a couple of times. And I was very familiar with the area in the sense that we spent 2 months in the summer there every year. Even though I'm not fluent in reading or writing Malayalam, the local language, I understand it pretty well. I don't speak it fluently, but I can speak it. So it wasn't like a foreigner going there to write a story and set it there. I had some familiarity with the rituals. And so, there came a point where you just have to say you have enough material and you just go with it. I had a lot of great researchers helping me too as I got into the novel. People in Kerala who were translators from Malayalam to English who, were really turned out to be real beautiful people who had a great understanding of what I was trying to get at and making sure I got it correctly. So it was a lot of fun, actually. I mean, I think if I had picked 1800 to 1900, it would have been much harder to research.
Although the changes from 1900 to 1970s, where the book is, are a lot more extraordinary than maybe the changes from 1800 to 1900, and you capture it so beautifully. I love the quote now, Abraham, research is just becomes an excuse for not writing. I'll remember that when I'm writing my own activities. I'm looking behind you on the screen here at your whiteboard, and I've been to your home and I've seen the whiteboard as the book progressed. Talk about that, how you use your visuals to just the process. How's that work for you? Does that help stimulate your imagination? Is that how you explore an idea? What's the process?
Well, I mean, the genesis of this whiteboard is my first book took me 4 years, My Own Country. The next one took me 6 years, and The Tennis Partner, and Cutting for Stone took me 8 years. And, I'm not very good in math, but I could see the trend was not in the direction I wanted. So I was really determined to do my best to plot out this novel. And that's hard to do. I mean, how do you plot out an entire novel when you haven't begun writing it? But I had a few things. I had the geography. I had this family, 3 generations of it. I had the principal character, the protagonist. And so I began to draw this elaborate whiteboard. And I do think visually. So, it was very helpful. But very soon I was deviating from the whiteboard, and I had to stop, photograph it, erase it, and start again. There's a maxim or a dictum in writing that character is determined by decisions taken under pressure. In other words, you can describe a character and talk about their habits and this and that, but it's only when you put that character under pressure that you really see who they are. And so I would put my characters under pressure, and next thing I know, they would do something entirely different from what I had in mind. And I'd be forced to sort of go change the whole direction of the plot. So I have had a lot of conversations about structure with other writers. John Irving, who's a friend and mentor, John says, you have to know the whole story. And he does. He knows the last line and the first line of the book. He knows the ending and beginning of every chapter. And he says, Abraham, if you don't know what you're hiding under the table and when you're going to bring it out, then you're not a writer. You're just an ordinary liar. You're just making this up as you go along, And then there are writers like Michael Ondaatje, and I told him this anecdote. And Michael also lives in Toronto now, and I got to see him on this book tour. And then he says, I know where John's coming from, but it's hard to get there. But I think eventually writers like me, we get to that point where John is, in the sense that at a certain point, after all these iterations of the whiteboard, I knew the whole story. And once I knew that, then I could really go back and make sure things connected and make sure what needed to be hidden was hidden and make sure I left enough clues. So, and that's a very satisfying moment when you get there. But to me, it came after years of writing, years of finding out that, this was not the right vein to pursue, and this was very fruitful, but it's not in this book. And, it's hard. I don't know any other way. I wish I have to find a more efficient way, but it eludes me right now.
Things like it work pretty darn well, Abraham. And since you mentioned that, just reacting to what you said, I read Andrew Solomon's review of your book in the New York Times, where he quite appropriately described you as a genuine humanist, and your ability, your expertise, a profound moral architecture of the spirit. But he suggested in that piece that your inspirational storytelling was like a Charles Dickens. Were you actually inspired by Charles Dickens? Because you just mentioned other authors that you had felt there, or perhaps influenced by.
I think it'd be hard not to be inspired by Dickens. And so I think growing up, I was an ardent reader. I think like both of you. I know Bob is very much of that mold. And I read all the classics, and Dickens was the consummate storyteller. I mean, the way he built character, who can forget Uriah Heep or David Copperfield, or, all these characters, they live. And so I think that I was very much influenced by Dickens, but perhaps more than Dickens, I think my big influences were more recent. They were Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Just love his brand of storytelling and his prose, which is a little more lyrical, more poetic, I think, than Dickens, who was colorful and breathtaking. So, we're always standing on the shoulders of giants. And in that sense, it's very much like medicine. There's very little that we do that's completely original. And yet everything we do has to be based on a very good knowledge of what has come, right? You have to know what's there before you can add the next level. And so, one of the things that's striking to me is the number of writers who are, doctor writers, you'll appreciate this, who, they're very good at what they do in medicine. Sometimes they have very senior administrative posts, and they take it on themselves that they want to write a novel, which turns out to be often a very thinly disguised fictional version of their own lives. And they feel no compunction to have read anything in the literature. So there's a great deal of hubris. And I think when you read great writers, you're humbled and you know what the standard is. And boy, by God, it takes a lot of work to build on that. And so that's what you're trying to do.
One of the great joys of my life, Eric, is I get to run into Abraham in our office suite here. Because as you know, our offices are next door to each other.
Yeah. I'm envious of you, that, Bob. Yeah,
that's right. Well, I remember when I first arrived, I came home after work one day, and our daughters who were home from college said, "So, Dad, how was your day?" I said, "Okay, you tell me how my day is." I popped into Abraham Verghese's office, and we talked about what books we were reading for a half hour. I said, for a chair of medicine, that's a pretty good day. But I like this notion, Abraham, that in order to write, you need to read, and you need to have read deeply and broadly. And you certainly have helped me with that. You do read both deeply and broadly. Throughout the book, there's some great quotes that I've heard you use over the years. Fiction is the great lie. and a number of others, Standing on the Shoulders of Giants. Again, I'm trying to get at the process here. That how do you do that? Are these just phrases that you've read so many times that they've become ingrained into your conversational vocabulary? Or are these things that you write down when something catches your imagination that you say, I might use this at some point? I know songwriters do that. They say they write a phrase and they might use it for a song many months from then. How do you do it?
Yeah, I do very much that. I think some of these are things that I heard and latched onto. For example, the phrase, God is in the details. It's amazing. I heard that in medical school, in residency in America, but I also heard it at the Iowa Writers Workshop. It's amazing how certain phrases are common to many different trades, if you like. The business about fiction being the great lie that tells the truth is always been something that resonated for me, because I feel like I'm always trying to make the case as to why we read fiction. And there's a trend, I think, especially in medicine and science, for people to feel, well, I'm a serious kind of guy. I only read biographies and memoirs. I don't read fiction. It's somehow beneath me. And it always surprises me because, we are brought up reading stories. We raise our children, our grandchildren by reading stories to them. This is essentially how we teach children about the wider world. And to abandon this practice, when you get of age, seems to be very premature. I also think that, as surrounded as we are by visual things, video and movies, and I don't knock any of them, they're great. There is something about this exercise of taking the digital signals we call words on a page and then making them into a mental movie in your head. So, this process of my writing a book, ultimately, it's a collaborative act with one reader. If you want a theory of how all this works in my mind is the writer provides the words, the reader provides their imagination, and somewhere in middle space, this mental movie begins to take shape. And it's very much theirs, which is why when they go to a movie theater, they're terribly disappointed if so-and-so has been cast as the lead when they visualized it another way. And I worry that if we don't have this exercise of, reading words and making our mental movies, a part of our brain atrophies. In my mind, I relate it to a kind of unimaginativeness in medicine that I don't mean, in terms of inventions, but if you think about it, the number of metaphors that are colorful, like the saber shin tibia, the mulberry molar, the salt and pepper skull, I don't know. This is off the top of my head. The mulberry molar, the strawberry tongue, the raspberry tongue. There are no metaphors, Eric or Bob, that I can point to in the last 50 years that are anywhere as colorful as the peg-shaped incisor or, any of that you and I were raised on. And it's striking because in my lifetime, I've seen so many new diseases in my specialty, AIDS and SARS and Lyme and ehrlichiosis and on it goes, but not one new metaphor. I think that this is partly because we've become so left brain rigidly focused that we're not being as colorful and imaginative with science as we can be. And I think we should be in order to communicate it well to other people.
Actually, it's very interesting and insightful about metaphors. You spoke about the written word, but you also did the audio book, which to me, to read this long a book, I don't know how many weeks that took to do. And then now you have, of course, a wonderful voice, which is why doing a podcast with you is a treat, because you're very soothing, very kind of deep, impactful voice. What was it like to read the book and then you're giving the audio signals rather than the written ones for people to make their mental movie?
Yeah, it was really a learning experience. I had a strange experience with Cutting for Stone of an audio that was well liked by the public. The guy won awards and I got to meet him. He's a young Indian actor, but, grew up in America. But I had problems with some of the pronunciation, and it turned out I was the only one who had problems. And so I actually decided to audition for reading this book. And people are surprised. Well, why do you have to audition? You wrote the book. Well, you have to. In fact, it's a red flag when authors read their own books in general, because to do a novel, you have to perform the novel. And, it's not a given that a writer will be able to perform the novel. And so I really had to learn how to perform the novel. I had to learn how to change the pitch in dialogue so that you can tell one gender from another, and how to do accents, but not overdo them. And I had to practice a, Glaswegian accent, a Geordie accent from Newcastle, upper crust British, Tamilian, Madrasi, Malayali, it was a lot of fun. And I must say, the weirdest thing, it took 3 weeks, Eric, to answer your question. But in doing that, in reading it aloud, even though I knew the story so well, it was still emotional for me, for the technician, for the producer, the director. And I also began to see connections that I swear to God I never put in there. So it was revealing to me, almost like the subconscious mind is doing things. You don't necessarily see them as you're doing it. And later you begin to appreciate that they're there. It was almost eerie. It was really quite beautiful. And then when I finally heard the product, mind you, this is so technology-driven, AI-driven, that they go in there and they take out all what they call stomach noises, and they take out all the little lip smacks. I mean, they also make you redo a lot, and the technology allows you to redo it smoothly, so you can just pick up in mid-sentence. You're hearing what you just said, and you pick right up. But even so, when I heard it, I was disappointed. I think none of us like the sound of our own voice when we hear it outside our head. We're used to this echo chamber that we live in. And so when you hear it coming at you, I don't think anybody's happy with it. So it's been very gratifying to see that for the most part, our listeners are enjoying it as much as the book. They're rating it. They're rating it well, which is delightful. I mean, I always read my work out loud in order to understand how it sounded, or had someone read it to me. And of late, I began to listen to more and more audiobooks. At first, I resisted it. It's like, I'm a purist. It has to be on the page. I can't be listening to the book. Yeah. But increasingly, I think up to 30% of readers are actually not reading, they're listening. And if you're a good writer, you're always reading the work aloud, because the assonance will be off and you won't know it until you read it. There'll be a false rhythm, a false rhyme that you have no desire to put in there. So it's been an interesting awakening experience to record this book.
I just would add, before Bob goes, is I auditioned to read one of my books and I flunked, so they wouldn't let me read it.
I don't believe that, Eric.
Well, on the audio piece, as a reader, I actually hear my books, and one of the struggles I have is some of the accents. And one of my favorite characters in your book, Abraham, was Digsby, who I, as the young son of a single mother, that's my life story, I was very attracted to him and his ability to rise above some incredibly difficult situations that occur over and over throughout his life. And he is an incredibly noble character. Can you give me a little bit of his voice, a little bit of his accent? I loved hearing him. And I would have to read it over and over to say, oh, that's what he's saying. So give me a little Digsby.
So were you listening? Can I ask, were you listening or were you reading to the book?
When I always read, but however my brain works, I hear the words in my brain.
Well, if you listen to the audiobook, you'll find the purist will tell you that maybe this is not a pure Scottish accent; it's more Irish. But that also is not wrong, because he's a Catholic of Irish ancestry who comes to. So it'll be like, matron, do we really have to put this person under anesthesia for this? So I was doing things like that.
Thank you.
Bob, you and Eric will appreciate this. At one point in the audio recording, there was this phrase, a Glaswegian proverb or something, and it was, the way it was spelt and the way I had to say it, I just couldn't find the right connection. So I called up Ewan Ashley, perhaps one of the cardiologists who's doing all this cutting-edge genetic research. And I said, Ewan, I'm going to send you this passage by my iPhone, and I want you to read it back into your phone, record it, and send it to me. He must have wondered, what the hell is this about? But he has such a beautiful Glaswegian accent. And so then I played that about 20 times and I delivered as best I could. So
Fantastic.
It really is a commitment to quality and accuracy. And now, one of the striking outgrowths of this book is how it was viewed by Oprah as one of the top 3 books that she's ever read in her life. And then you sat with her on this memorable segment. I was just blown away. I'm sure Bob was as well. And she wants to make a movie on the book. And I think she's in love with you, Abraham. So tell us, what was it like to have this backing by Oprah? I mean, it's just so extraordinary, the experience you had with her.
yeah, it really is extraordinary. I mean, I don't know what to say. I knew about a month before the announcement that she had picked the book, because I get this call out of the blue. I'm expecting a call from my publisher, but it's not from my publisher. It's from her, and a very distinctive voice. And it took me a long time to believe this was actually her. I kept trying to question her, and she tells me later that she decided to just launch into the book. And she had read that book inside out, and she'd gone back and read my other books. She looked up papers on me. I mean, people assume that, she has producers doing all this for her. But I think the key to her success is when she takes on something, she knows it cold. Nobody doing this for her.
Wow.
So we had the most wonderful 40-minute dialogue, and I never saw this coming, because I had really hoped that Cutting for Stone would be a book that she picked. It was right up her alley, I thought. Africa and fistulas, and it just had all the elements that I thought would be good for her, that she would like. And she tells me later, she says, I don't know that I would have picked that book. She says, I was doing so many shows back to back that my attention span was this long. I'm not sure I was ready for that book. But she says, you're a different writer now. You're a better writer. She read that book, by the way. And she says, you're a better writer, and I'm ready for the message in this book. And she said that she started reading and she just knew this was the book a couple of pages in, it's been a phenomenon on the book tour. I think I alluded to it, and I don't want to sound like I'm making too much of this, but I don't understand it myself, where people are having this great connection with these simple characters who are bringing something out of them, about themselves, and about the unheralded people in their lives, perhaps. I don't quite know. But I will tell you something I think I shared with Bob, that it was potentially the most nerve-wracking moment of one's life, I would guess, to be appearing, on CBS Morning News with Oprah and Gail. And I was somehow, just as after I met her and I was getting on stage, I felt this enormous calmness, I was not nervous at all. I don't know, I think it was a sense that all the dues I've paid, and Bob knows how many ups and downs I've had with this book, that, that for once I wasn't like, oh, shucks, do I deserve this? I really felt like I belonged there, and this was my moment, and I wasn't going to waste it by being falsely humble, I mean, not that I was arrogant, but you know what I'm trying to say? It was my moment, and I sort of knew it, and I felt that deserving for the effort I put into that book.
Well, I can vouch for the effort of weeks at a time when you needed to just bear down and write. But Abraham, let's talk a little bit about the book tour, since we're talking about Oprah. And you say that people have appreciated the simplicity, simple people doing extraordinary things. To me, none of these were simple people. These were deep, complex, and many times conflicted individuals. What are you experiencing on tour? What are people talking with you about? What's moved them, and what's moved you from talking to your reading audience?
To address the first part of your question, I think you're right. I mean, they're not all simple people. When I say that, I'm referring to Big Amachi, the main character. And for the longest time, I've been saying, well, I didn't have any thesis in mind. I wasn't proselytizing. My goal is always a good story well told. That's the goal, But the truth is, when I look back now, I'm sort of seeing a pattern. I think it's good people who make bad decisions, and then are trying to atone. They're trying to make up for it. And you know, that's me, I suppose. That was me coming through, you know, the sense of being able to see the mistakes I've made and wanting to atone for them, to make them whole. So there's a part of me in many of those characters like Digby and Philippos. But on the book tour, it's interesting because, you know, I think because of Cutting for Stone, I have a reader base. But with Oprah's, you know, enthusiasm, we sold out all the venues. I mean, there were just places that people couldn't get in. And the other phenomenon, which I thought was wonderful, was so many young doctors showing up. I mean, they look incredibly young, but they're already neurologists. They're, you know, they're attendings, but to me, they look like babies, you know, to tell me that one or other of my books was deeply meaningful to them. And boy, that tops any sort of prize that one can get. And so that was, you know, that was huge. The tour was, you know, most of the time you do a tour to generate PR, to support the independent bookstore, and to sell the books. And in a funny way, we were starting backwards because the book was already flying off the shelf, and you know, the indie bookstores were already getting all the attention, and the audience could not be fulfilled. So it was, you know, it was almost like I was going to each place. I didn't need to go at one level, but I needed to go in the sense that I love to support the indie bookstores, and all these people wanted to come see me. And it wasn't just to see me. They were rallying around whatever this thing I represent. I don't quite know what it is, but it was beautiful. It was just like a big love fest. And, you know, I have to give a shout out to Stanford. And this is not self-serving because my boss is on the show, but, you know, how many universities will back someone like me, you know, allow me to have this aspect of my life? And it's a long-term investment. And, you know, it's been 10 years, and now it's bringing Stanford, I hope, the kind of, you know, acclaim that it deserves for doing just that. So I've been very, very lucky. I just kept, you know, I'm praying every night, just counting my blessings and just full of gratitude for everything that's happened in the last 10 years or more.
I wanted to ask you, because just like the question I posed earlier about the accuracy across many decades before you were on this earth, you're not a surgeon, I don't think. And you wrote about surgery, whether it was neurosurgery, hand surgery, breech birth, as if you were, you know, those kinds of surgeons or obstetricians. How did you do that?
Yeah, you know, I think a couple of reasons why. I think one is surgery is inherently more dramatic, you know, or invasive cardiology. You know, these things are inherently full of drama, more than an abstract discussion of endocarditis, for example, which I could write about fairly easily. But also, I think I was always enamored a bit by surgery. When I was an intern in India, you couldn't get your degree till you did a 3-month internship and everything. And as a medical student, I had a surgeon who had taken me under his wing, a professor and a great teacher. He thought I was going to be a surgeon, and I think I probably did too. And I got to do a lot of stuff with him. And then as a 3 months of internship, you know, I got to do a gastrojejunostomy, you know, on my last day. They did the vagotomy part, but I did the whole, and it's a heady feeling, which I never forgot. And I loved internal medicine. I think I love surgery just about equally, but coming to America, I really felt that medicine was the way to go. It was, if you remember, in those days, surgery residencies were all pyramidal programs where, you know, they famously took foreign graduates and spat you out after 2 or 3 years. And I didn't want to take that chance. You never got to be chief resident. I loved internal medicine more, perhaps, although at that time I was, you know, could have gone either way. But I always had some regret about turning my back on a field that was inherently so dramatic. And so I have a lot of surgeon buddies, and I hang around with them. And pretty much for all the operations described in this novel, I watched it, you know, more than a couple of times, and, you know, even got to retract and whatnot. So yeah, it's fun writing about it.
You know, Eric, I know one of the reasons you've had these podcasts with Abraham is to think about the humanity in medicine that can be so missing, and you've written eloquently about that.
You're too kind, Bob. But one of the things I would say is that my friendship with Abraham over this last decade has brought out the humanistic qualities, that kind of a much deeper sense. And I think the book exudes that. You've had a big influence on me, and I know I'm Bob and I'm everyone you touch. And I think what you've done here, Abraham, you've touched millions of people, will be, by the time this book gets around over the years ahead. Just like Cutting for Stone, it only was discovered later. And then, now many books have 1 million copies out there, plus, and this one will too. So congratulations. We're going to talk to you more about the book, of course, over the years ahead, but this has been fun. It's a rare opportunity to turn the table around and get some of your inner thoughts as to this master work. I mean, it's really very, it's an extraordinary experience just to go through it and to learn about the condition that you somehow discovered to be the lace, the generations together, the modern medicine evolution, and these characters that you inevitably love, and how somehow you bring hope into tragedy.
I must say, I felt very good about the medical profession at the end of my book tour, because, I've always felt that medicine was a romantic and passionate pursuit, a calling. And, the 10 to 15% of people who were showing up were physicians who felt that way. And yes, they're stressed out and they're burnt out and they want to talk about it, but boy, their heart is in the right place. And what a privilege it is, for all of us, all three of us, to be the age we are and, to be looked up to at times. And, to feel that people are responding to some of the principles that we hold dear, and that, that they count on us in a sense to articulate those principles and to stick by them. I think both you and Bob have been very courageous in the things you've stood up for, not always the most popular things, but we got to do the right thing. And my sentiment from the last 3 weeks is doctors want to do the right thing, and we're on track.
Yeah, it'd be tough to top that. And I'll just say, Abraham, thank you. It's a privilege to have read your book. As Eric said, it brings out the great themes that have made literature great, going back to the Greek and Roman writers, that you've taken tragedy and shown us hope. You've connected people who we can connect with. And it was really a privilege to read the book. And I know the amount of work that went into it, which made it maybe even more special, because I appreciated the work that you poured into this over the course of the last decade. Now, having said that, I hope the next one doesn't take another decade, and that Eric and I can have you back for another discussion. But Eric, thank you so much for letting me join you on your podcast. This has been a lot of fun for me.
Thanks for
a wonderful experience. Thank you, guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you.